You're drifting down a corridor you've never seen before, though somehow it feels familiar. The air smells faintly of wax and dust, the kind of scent that only old stone palaces can brew after centuries of candle smoke and whispered secrets. The torches along the walls sputter softly, casting shadows that stretch longer than they should, and you find yourself thinking, well, you probably won't survive this. A little dark humor to start things off. Because honestly, most people who wandered the midnight halls of royal palaces back in the Middle Ages didn't survive very long, especially if they were caught sneaking somewhere they shouldn't be. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love for you to comment below where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step carefully, your footsteps echoing on the flagstone floor, each one a reminder that these halls once carried the weight of monarchs, guards, and the occasional forbidden lover. You're walking in their traces, retracing a kind of ghost map of intimacy and power. The tapestries on the walls depict battles, saints, and heroes. But your eyes catch the hidden details. Hands a little too close together. Glances stitched into silk that look far less holy and far more human. You realize quickly that history is never just about crowns and wars. It's about what people wanted when no one else was supposed to be looking. And queens, despite their gilded crowns, were as bound by flesh and longing as anyone else. Maybe more so, because every glance, every touch, carried the risk of both scandal and strategy. The truth is, the corridors of power in the medieval world were never just political. They were velvet-lined traps of desire, where whispers carried farther than trumpets, and where a kiss could tilt the balance of a kingdom. As you move deeper, you pass a chamber door, heavy with iron studs. Behind it, centuries ago, a queen might have leaned close to a knight sworn to her husband, her words promising him more than just duty. Imagine the tension. Armor clinking against silk, vows to God colliding with vows whispered in the dark. Scholars still argue whether queens used such moments only for companionship, or whether these affairs were calculated moves, power games woven into flesh. One fact we do know. In the 14th century, Queen Isabella of France, sometimes called the She-Wolf, was accused of taking a lover who helped her depose her own husband, Edward II. Now, the truth is slippery here because chroniclers at the time had their own political axes to grind, but the suggestion lingers that a queen's desire could shift the very crown from one head to another. And isn't it deliciously strange? A simple embrace behind closed doors might ripple outwards into wars, assassinations, or changes in dynasties. History often looks grand and immovable, but here you are, seeing it hinge on fragile human cravings. You pause at a window overlooking the courtyard. The moonlight spills across the cobblestones, silvering the shapes of guards who once patrolled this very space. You wonder how many of them heard the rumors. The queen is too fond of her page. The queen lingers too long at confession with the young priest. The queen's smile for her minstrel is a little too generous. Odd detail. In some courts, queens would actually disguise secret meetings as lessons. A poetry reading, a chess match, even embroidery circles became camouflage for more intimate encounters. The droning rhythm of needle stitching could mask the quickened breaths of something far less innocent. And yet behind the daring was a real danger. One wrong glance, one misplaced letter, one servant gossiping in the wrong ear. Suddenly, you weren't just a queen seeking warmth in a cold marriage. You were a traitor, an adulteress, sometimes even a witch accused of charming men for political ends. The stakes were never simply personal. They were lethal. As you trace your hand along the stone wall, you notice the grooves, marks left from centuries of torches being set into sconces. You imagine a servant, one hand carrying flame, the other trying desperately not to look at what they shouldn't see. the queen herself, leaning close to someone she wasn't supposed to. Mainstream history fact here. Adultery, technically, was considered treason for queens in medieval Europe. Why? Because a king's lineage, the heir to the throne, had to be unquestionably his. If a queen bore a child that wasn't the king's, the entire succession could be thrown into chaos. So her body wasn't just her own, it was state property. And yet, despite that danger, queens still risked everything. It makes you think, maybe the power wasn't only in the throne or the crown. Maybe it was in those hidden, trembling moments that could never be spoken of aloud. You move past another tapestry, this one showing a hunt. Horses charge forward, hounds leap, and yet tucked in the corner, a lady extends her hand to a knight in a way that makes you squint. Was it the artist's mischief, or a subtle nod to truths everyone whispered but no one wrote openly? Quirky fact. Medieval artists often included little side scenes in margins of manuscripts. Tiny drawings of rabbits jousting, monkeys dressed as priests, even lovers sneaking kisses. Scholars still argue whether these were playful jokes, biting satire, or subtle commentary on the very society they served. But here, tonight, you imagine them as winks across centuries, reminding you that behind the rigid laws and sermons, people were always delightfully messy. The corridor curves, and you follow, each step slower, softer, as if you don't want to wake the ghosts lingering here. A draft brushes your cheek, colder than it should be, and you think about the women who once felt the same chill, waiting nervously for a secret knock on the door. Some queens turned their chambers into fortresses of discretion. Heavy curtains muffled sound, inner doors kept servants at a distance, and trusted ladies-in-waiting became gatekeepers of passion. Without them, no affair could survive. And if you lean in close enough, you can almost hear the whispers. "He is coming, my lady," quickly, before anyone notices. And maybe that's the heartbeat of it all. These women, trapped in marriages arranged for politics, not love, carved out slivers of control in the most dangerous way possible by claiming intimacy on their own terms. The corridor doesn't end, it bends, and suddenly you're stepping into a chamber that smells of lavender and smoke. You can almost hear the creak of floorboards beneath heavy velvet dresses, the faint rustle of parchment folded quickly and tucked into a sleeve. This is where you learn that crowns were never just gold and jewels, they were also corsets, tight enough to bruise ribs, reminding you that politics squeezed harder than bone. You linger, letting your hand drift across the carved wood of a throne pulled close to the fire. Imagine a queen sinking into it after hours of public ceremony, the crown taken off, the weight still pressing down invisibly. She's expected to be wife, mother, saint, diplomat, all at once. And yet every role is tied to a husband who doesn't necessarily care for her beyond her political value. You begin to understand why power and desire blurred together, why secret lovers were not only comforting but also useful. Queens were chess players, and intimacy was a piece on the board. You see her now, not one queen, but a mosaic of them across centuries. Isabella of France, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Catherine de' Medici, all walking the same balance beam, corsets cinched, hearts racing for reasons that had little to do with romance novels and everything to do with survival. Scholars still argue whether Eleanor of Aquitaine actually took lovers during the Second Crusade, but the suspicion alone shows you how tightly gossip was woven into politics. And you realize, when you live in a world where your husband controls armies and land, a lover isn't just a lover. He's leverage. A candle flickers in the draft, and you lean toward the flame, picturing a queen at her writing desk. She dips the quill, scratches careful lines, letters that are part love notes, part political manifestos. "Come tonight for the sake of my heart," she writes. But between those lines, another message. "Bring news. Bring loyalty. Bring me something I can use against the king if I must." Mainstream fact. Catherine de' Medici, though often painted as coldly strategic, was accused by enemies of maintaining networks of lovers who spied for her. The evidence? Slim, exaggerated by rivals, but the image stuck. A queen weaving power through her bedchamber. You might smirk here, realizing how often medieval propaganda used sex as a weapon. If a woman held influence, people whispered she must be lying with someone to get it. Yet behind those whispers lay a truth. Sometimes she did, and sometimes it worked. Your gaze shifts upward to the painted ceiling. Cherubs hover there, rosy and smug, as if laughing at the mortals below. Quirky fact: in some palaces, artisans painted symbols only the sharp-eyed could catch: interlocked rings, entwined vines, or a slyly smiling Cupid nudged into a corner. Were these nods to royal romances, or just the artist's joke? Scholars still argue, but tonight you choose to believe the artists were gossipers too, leaving permanent graffiti on the sky. You smile because you know gossip doesn't die, it just changes outfits. The fire in the hearth pops, and you imagine a queen loosening her corset strings, each sigh of relief not only about breathing easier, but about shedding layers of expectation. She sends away her ladies, keeping only one trusted confidant. The door closes, and soon after, another one opens. A figure steps in, sometimes a knight, sometimes a poet, sometimes even a visiting diplomat. You notice how the air thickens. Every glance is a negotiation, every touch a treaty. To outsiders, it would look like simple lust. But here, you sense something sharper. These affairs were insurance policies. If the king faltered, if the nobles turned hostile, a queen might rely on her lover not just for comfort, but for an army, or at least a dagger in the right place at the right time. And yet, danger was always close. Queens weren't free spirits. They were trapped birds, fluttering in gilded cages. Any rumor could slit their wings. A kiss could become a death sentence. You imagine the tension of living like that, always wondering, is tonight's lover tomorrow's betrayer? Mainstream fact to anchor you. Anne Boleyn, centuries later, would be accused of adultery with multiple men, including her musician. Most historians now believe these charges were fabricated by enemies, but the point is clear. Sex was the most convenient weapon to strike down a queen. One accusation could topple her faster than an invading army. You let that sink in, and you can almost hear the nervous laugh of a woman who knows every embrace might be her last. Odd little detail. In some inventories of royal belongings, you find records of gifted girdles or embroidered sleeves that don't match the king's usual style. Scholars still argue whether these were tokens from lovers, disguised as innocent accessories. Imagine the boldness of pinning a lover's gift right beneath the king's nose. It's dangerous, it's cheeky, and it's exactly the kind of small rebellion that makes your heart race even centuries later. The chamber grows warmer, and you slow your steps, circling the throne once more. You understand now, corsets weren't just fabric, they were metaphors. Restrictive, beautiful, painful. They shaped queens' bodies, but they also shaped their choices. And when a queen loosened those strings in secret, she wasn't just freeing herself from silk and whalebone. She was claiming a power the crown itself never gave her. You take a breath with her, feeling the weight lift, and you know this is only the beginning of her story. The chamber fades behind you as you walk back into those dim, flickering corridors. This time, you're holding something in your hand. A folded letter, sealed with wax, still warm from the candle that dripped over it. You tilt it toward the light, and though you can't quite read the words, you know what's inside. Not just love, not just lust, but coded power. In medieval palaces, paper wasn't simply paper. It was dynamite, if the wrong eyes saw it. You picture a queen bent over her desk, quill scratching softly. She writes in layers, sweet nothings wrapped around political secrets. Careful lines that look like poems but could be read as maps, instructions, even veiled threats. To most, it's just another courtly verse. But to the man slipping through shadowed halls to find her, It's an invitation to her chambers, to her confidence, to a dangerous alliance. Odd little truth. Medieval queens sometimes disguise their handwriting, practicing different scripts, so even if a letter was discovered, it wouldn't immediately trace back to them. Scholars still argue whether certain anonymous poems of courtly love were actually written by noblewomen themselves, hiding behind the mask of anonymous. Sure, you smile at the thought. Maybe those verses you skim in dusty anthologies weren't some bored monk's rambling, but a queen's secret heart. You pass into another room, its walls lined with cabinets and trunks. Imagine them stuffed with parchment and scrolls, sealed letters bundled with ribbons. Most are gone now, burned, lost, or hidden. But a few survive, and they whisper loudly across time. Mainstream historical fact. Queen Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI, was accused of corresponding secretly with allies, some claimed lovers, who helped her lead armies during the Wars of the Roses. Whether or not the letters were romantic, they reveal how intimately politics and personal ties tangled. A letter could summon troops as easily as it could summon a man to her bedside. You slip the folded parchment into your sleeve and keep walking. It rustles against your arm like a secret heartbeat. The corridor bends again, leading to a tiny alcove lit by one guttering candle. A servant lingers here, waiting. In your mind's eye, you see him pass the queen's note into the gloved hand of a knight. No words exchanged. Just a flicker of eyes, a brush of fingers. Then the knight disappears into the dark, and the servant hurries back, praying no one saw. Quirky fact. In some courts, carrier pigeons were trained to deliver messages from inner chambers to distant garrisons. Imagine the sight of a bird lifting off a palace roof at midnight, carrying a queen's secret. Not exactly romantic, but practical, efficient, and silent. And yet, you can't shake the image of a pigeon as Cupid, feathers glinting in moonlight, carrying both love and treason tied to its ankle. You pause, because the walls seem closer here, as though they're leaning in to eavesdrop. You realize how dangerous it all was. A letter, if intercepted, could undo everything. Queens lived with that constant thrum of anxiety. What if her words, meant for one man, ended up in the hands of another? Mainstream anchor. In 1567, letters known as the casket letters were produced against Mary, Queen of Scots, supposedly proving her affair with the Earl of Bothwell. To this day, historians argue over their authenticity. Were they forged by her enemies or genuine love notes that doomed her? Either way, the point is clear. Paper was as deadly as steel. You feel a chill, as though the parchment in your sleeve just got heavier. The candle gutters lower, and the alcove dissolves into another hallway. You keep walking, footsteps slow, your mind replaying the quiet urgency of letters slipping hand to hand. Each one a gamble, each one a risk worth taking. Because for a queen in a marriage built on politics, words to a lover weren't only about passion. They were proof of agency, a chance to whisper her own will into the universe. And you wonder, if you unfolded the parchment now, what would it say to you? The parchment slips from your sleeve as you walk, fluttering into the shadows. You bend to pick it up, but instead of letters and wax, you find cold iron beneath your fingertips. Chainmail, heavy and sharp. When you look up, a knight is standing before you. His armor glints faintly in the torchlight, his helmet tucked under one arm, his eyes fixed on you with the kind of intensity that makes you forget he's supposed to be a servant of the king, not the queen. And suddenly you understand the truth of it. Knights weren't always just guards. Sometimes they were more. Imagine him posted outside her chamber door, night after night, sworn to protect her with his sword. He hears her laughter echo down the hallway, smells her perfume when she passes. He swears loyalty to the crown, but his gaze lingers on the woman behind it. Slowly, that loyalty blurs. Is he guarding her life or longing for her touch? Mainstream fact, Lancelot and Guinevere's tale, though legendary, reflects a medieval anxiety that was very real. The fear of knights becoming too close to queens. Courtly love, a cultural tradition of knights adoring noblewomen from afar, made the idea almost respectable. Yet everyone knew the line between fantasy and reality could be crossed in the quiet of a guarded chamber. And you can't help but grin, because you know people haven't changed. Give someone a long night, a little proximity, and a lot of tension, and see what happens. The knight steps closer, the clink of his mail like a drumbeat in the silence. You notice how absurdly heavy his armor looks, how ridiculous it must have been to sneak through dark hallways sounding like a sack of pots. Odd little detail. Some knights, especially when acting as escorts in court, wore padded surcoats or lighter mail instead of full plate, precisely to avoid sounding like walking chandeliers. Scholars still argue whether certain palace guard rosters were shuffled intentionally to keep overly friendly knights away from overly restless queens. But tonight, there is no shuffle. Tonight, the knight lingers. You move with him down the hallway, the two of you passing frescoes of saints glaring down in judgment. His hand brushes yours, the tiniest slip, and you feel how charged it is. Every gesture between them carried danger, because if seen, it wasn't just flirtation, it was treason. You pause at a window where moonlight spills across his steel. In that glow, he doesn't look like a soldier anymore. He looks like temptation wrapped in iron. You understand why queens risked everything. In a world where their choices were bound in corsets and contracts, here stood someone willing to obey, not just as a knight, but as a man. Mainstream anchor, Eleanor of Aquitaine, though legendary in her own right, was dogged by rumors of taking crusader knights as lovers. Most modern historians dismiss it as slander spread by her enemies, but the myth itself reveals how believable it seemed to contemporaries. If a queen led men to war, surely someone imagined she also led them into her bed. And isn't it telling that the idea of knights beyond duty haunted every court across Europe? The knight removes his gauntlet, and the sound of metal on stone echoes louder than it should. You freeze, half expecting a guard to rush in. But no one comes. The silence here is deeper than stone. It's complicit. You think about the countless nameless guards who might have looked away, pretended not to notice, some out of loyalty to the queen, some out of fear, and some perhaps because they too wanted her smile. Oddly enough, records exist of guards being bribed with trinkets, wine, or land to stand elsewhere at certain hours. Scholars still argue whether these payments were for routine corruption or for something far more intimate. The knight places his helmet on the windowsill. His hair falls loose, his eyes soften, and for a moment, he is no longer the king's man. He is hers, and you, drifting in this memory, realize that every secret meeting, every stolen glance, wasn't just lust. It was survival disguised as romance, power disguised as passion. Because when a queen leaned toward a knight, she wasn't just seeking warmth. She was seeking someone who might fight for her. Not because the law demanded it, but because he desired her enough to risk everything. And sometimes that was worth more than any army. The night fades back into shadow as you walk further down the corridor, and suddenly the air shifts. A sweet, resinous smell curls around you. Incense, thick and cloying. You know where you are before you see it. A chapel, small, candlelit, and echoing with the faint hush of prayers that linger even when no one's speaking. Queens were expected to be pious, to confess often, to keep their souls as polished as their crowns. But sometimes confession became more than repentance. Sometimes the man behind the screen wasn't just a priest. He was a confidant, a comforter, and occasionally something far more dangerous. You step into the dim little space, and the glow of votive candles paints the walls in trembling gold. Imagine her there, kneeling, head bowed, speaking her sins softly. On the other side, a young priest listens, heart thudding louder than his rosary beads. He shouldn't feel this way. He knows it. She knows it. Yet in the claustrophobic hush of the confessional, words turn heavy, breaths turn slow, and what begins as a whisper of guilt becomes an invitation. Mainstream historical anchor. There were persistent rumors about Queen Joan B of Naples, accused of scandalous affairs with clerics and courtiers alike. Whether true or not, the idea that a queen could draw even priests into her orbit terrified chroniclers, who painted her as dangerously unholy. You lean closer to the wooden screen, hearing it creak. One slip of the tongue, one trembling phrase, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," could mean two things at once. Quirky little fact. Some medieval confessionals weren't booths at all. They were just benches, side by side, in semi-public chapels. The so-called screen was sometimes nothing more than a cloth, thin enough that shadows passed across it. Imagine how easily glances could linger, how a hand could almost brush another through the fabric. Scholars still argue whether the design of later enclosed booths was meant to prevent temptation or simply to control the gossip that spilled out of open confessions. You walk past the altar, tracing the edge of a candlestick. Wax drips down, hardened into tiny mountains. You can see her hand gripping that candlestick once, steadying herself as she confessed far more than prayers. To a priest, she could admit desires she dared not tell even her closest ladies. And priests, well, they weren't immune. Odd, isn't it? Men sworn to celibacy, becoming gatekeepers of Queen's most private thoughts. How could that not lead, at least sometimes, to forbidden intimacy? A draft sways the candles, and their light flares across the painted saints on the walls. Their eyes follow you, judgmental, stern, unyielding. You almost laugh. Because you know if those saints could talk, the stories they'd tell would put gossiping courtiers to shame. Mainstream fact, to anchor again. In Avignon during the papal court's relocation, documents accused multiple noblewomen, including high-ranking queens, of unseemly familiarity with clerics. Whether it was politics, bribery, or lust, no one can say. But the presence of priests in royal scandals was too frequent to ignore. You picture it vividly. A late-night chapel, incense so thick it makes your head swim, a queen lingering long after her prayers are done. The priest leans close, his words low, his hands betraying him. The palace outside sleeps. But here, between stone walls and sacred icons, sin blooms like roses in the dark. And sometimes, that was worth more than any army. And you think, perhaps queens didn't just use lovers for power. Perhaps they used the church itself, bending holy men into pawns on their private chessboard. A lover in armor could fight for you, but a lover in robes? He could forgive you. The candles gutter low, almost out, and you step back into the corridor. The smell of incense clings to you as though you've confessed something too. And as the door shuts softly behind you, you realize the most dangerous secrets weren't always spoken in the bedroom. Sometimes they were whispered in God's own house. The scent of incense still clings to your clothes as you leave the chapel, but the mood shifts again. The corridor brightens with torchlight, and the air feels busier, louder, as if unseen voices are buzzing around you. You've stepped into the world of courtiers, the men and women who orbited the queen like moths to flame. Here, gossip is the real currency. Every glance, every rumor, every smirk traded between silk-draped nobles becomes part of a larger game. And for a queen, lovers hidden among these courtiers weren't always about lust. They were bargaining chips, useful pieces in negotiations where power was never given freely. You pause by a carved wooden screen where shadows dance, imagining a queen seated with her ladies, fans flicking open, laughter ringing out just a little too loud. At her side, a courtier leans in, whispering something that makes her smile. Is it a joke? A pledge? A promise he'll deliver more than gossip when the candles burn lower? Mainstream anchor, Queen Isabella of Castile, Later, half of the power couple, Ferdinand and Isabella, was known to wield her ladies and courtiers like weapons, pairing and rewarding them strategically. Though she herself wasn't scandalized by affairs, chronicles suggest she understood perfectly well how queens before her had used flirtations and favoritism to strengthen alliances. And you realize for many queens, desire wasn't simply pleasure. It was negotiation with skin in the game. The court hums like a hive in your ears. One lady-in-waiting leans closer, muttering to another, their jeweled hairpins glinting like antennae. You notice how nothing here is private, not really. Even stolen kisses in alcoves ripple outward as rumors. And yet, queens used this. They knew a whispered story could travel faster than a royal decree. Quirky fact. In Burgundy's court, it was common for nobles to give each other love tokens. Ribbons, gloves, even spoons engraved with initials. Many of these were purely symbolic, but a surprising number were later traced to actual affairs. Scholars still argue whether these gifts were innocent courtly love gestures or evidence of full-blown liaisons. You grin. A spoon might not seem sexy now, but in a medieval palace it could mean everything. You step into a larger hall where music echoes faintly. Lutes, flutes, and the shuffle of silk across polished floors. Dancing wasn't just entertainment. It was theater for intimacy. Partners' hands touched too long, eyes met across the swirl, and suddenly everyone was whispering. Picture the queen twirling, her gown spreading like ink in water. Across from her, a favored courtier bows a little lower than necessary, his eyes lingering just a fraction too long. And though a dozen courtiers notice, no one says a word. Why? Because gossip here is traded like coin, saved for moments when it can buy you favor or destroy someone else. Mainstream historical fact. In the French court of the Valois kings, the concept of mignons, favored companions, sometimes suspected lovers, extended not just to kings, but queens as well. Chroniclers recorded scandal after scandal, hinting that influence often flowed through beds as much as through council chambers. You let that sink in. This wasn't just about lust. It was about loyalty. A lover might guard a queen's secrets more fiercely than a husband ever would. A draft carries laughter down the hall, sharp and knowing. You follow it into a smaller chamber where courtiers recline on cushions, playing dice and trading whispers. One man gestures broadly, mimicking an embrace, and the others laugh too loudly. Rumors here are performance. Some are lies. Some are truths exaggerated, but all are dangerous. Odd little detail. One preserved record from an English court lists fines levied against courtiers who spoke too freely of the queen's private life. Imagine being taxed for gossip. It didn't stop them, of course. It only made the whispers more valuable. Scholars still argue whether these fines were meant to protect queens or merely hide inconvenient truths. You slip back into the hallway, the sound of dice and laughter fading. You realize that for queens, courtiers were double-edged blades. A lover could become an ally, but just as easily, a liability. Every bargain made in silken whispers could turn into blackmail, and yet you sense why they risked it. In a court, where everyone wanted something, sometimes the only way to get it was to want someone back. The dice and laughter vanish as the corridor narrows again. This time the ceiling soars higher, gilded beams stretching above you, frescoes sprawling like dreamscapes across the plaster, angels, cherubs, gilded vines, all very holy, very proper, and yet you can't shake the thought. How many scandals played out right under these painted ceilings? Because in palaces, walls weren't just walls. They were echo chambers. Every rumor, every muffled sound, every misplaced glance ricocheted until it became something larger, juicier, more damning. And you, walking beneath the saints and cupids, realize gossip wasn't just idle chatter. It was a weapon, sharpened by repetition, gilded with embellishment, and aimed straight at crowns. You tilt your head up at a fresco of the Virgin Mary, her serene face glowing in the torchlight. Imagine sitting beneath her image at a banquet, while whispers about the queen's special friend buzzed just loud enough to make courtiers smirk into their goblets. One raised eyebrow, one pointed cough, and suddenly everyone at the table knew something they hadn't actually seen. Mainstream anchor. Take Queen Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI of England. During the Wars of the Roses, her political enemies accused her of taking the Duke of Suffolk, or even the Earl of Somerset, as her lover. Historians now largely view these claims as propaganda meant to discredit her, but at the time, the rumors spread like wildfire, feeding the perception that she wielded influence not through counsel, but through her bed. And you think, in a world where image mattered more than truth, gossip could crown or crush a queen. You stroll into a grand hall, chandeliers swaying above, their candles dripping wax like tears. The air here is heavy with perfume and sweat, the residue of endless feasts. Courtiers recline at long tables, their laughter echoing beneath gilded arches. But listen closely. Beneath the clatter of goblets, you can hear it, the hissing undercurrent of scandal, odd little detail. In Burgundy's court, chroniclers noted that serving staff often spread the spiciest rumors. Maids, cooks, even stable boys carried tales from chamber to chamber. Sometimes queens deliberately allowed a servant to overhear something suggestive, knowing it would blossom into the perfect rumor, timed to manipulate the court's perception. Scholars still argue whether certain queens orchestrated scandals against themselves, just to distract enemies from real political maneuvers. You smirk. Imagine weaponizing gossip about your own sex life to cover a tax reform. That's power. The frescoes above twist in your vision. Cupids and saints blur with sly smiles, as though they too are in on the joke. You picture a queen sitting beneath them, knowing exactly what people are saying, and smiling into her wine. Because sometimes the trick wasn't silencing scandal. It was letting it run wild until it became untouchable. Mainstream fact again. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, was plagued with accusations of sorcery, lust, and manipulation. While some rumors were baseless, she occasionally leaned into the image of being dangerous and mysterious. Better feared than ignored, after all. You wander further, through an alcove where stained glass windows throw colored patterns across the stone floor. In the flickering light, you imagine two courtiers whispering, leaning too close, their shadows mingling against the glass. One laugh, one touch, and suddenly the rumor mill grinds into motion. The palace doesn't sleep, it feeds. And the queen? She doesn't just survive it, she thrives in it. Every scandal gives her cover, every whisper buys her time. As you step back into the corridor, the frescoes fade into darkness behind you, but their painted faces seem to linger, watching, amused. And you can't shake the feeling that half the saints on the ceiling weren't judging at all. They were laughing, because they'd seen it all before. The laughter under painted ceilings still lingers in your ears, but the corridor narrows again, darker this time. The torchlight feels weaker here, swallowed by heavy tapestries. You brush your fingers across the woven fabric, hunting scenes, knights on horseback, deer with glassy eyes. Yet all you can think about is the darker truth those threads concealed. Behind walls like these, queens played with fire. And sometimes, fire burned. Because lovers weren't always safety. Sometimes they were poison. Literally, you turn into a chamber lined with cabinets of silver goblets and gilded plates. Banquets were staged here. Feasts dripping with roasted meats, candied fruits, and wine poured until courtiers stumbled. And in every sip, in every bite, lay a risk. Queens who place their trust in secret lovers also risk their throats, because one betrayal, one drop of powder or tincture could end everything. Mainstream anchor. Consider Queen Joanna of Navarre, stepmother to Henry V of England. She was accused, though falsely, of dabbling in witchcraft and attempting to poison the king. Whether it was slander or not, The rumor shows how quickly intimacy could be twisted into suspicion. A queen with secret alliances always walked the razor's edge. You pick up one of the goblets. The metal is cold in your hands, heavier than it looks. You picture her lips on the rim, then his, her lover's, passing it back with a smile that might mean desire or doom. Odd little fact. Some medieval queens had official tasters, men whose sole job was to test food and drink for poison. Yet historians have found letters where tasters were bribed or manipulated by powerful factions. Scholars still argue whether queens secretly bypassed tasters when they trusted a lover, or foolishly trusted the wrong one. Imagine that, slipping a goblet to someone you believed adored you, only to realize too late that he adored your downfall even more. You move deeper into the chamber, and the air feels heavier, almost suffocating. A narrow table sits against the wall, strewn with dried herbs, glass vials, and mortar and pestles. Some were medicines, sure, but others? Well, in the wrong hands, medicine and poison blur. Queens and their lovers knew it. Picture her lover, sliding a tiny pouch of powder across the table. For headaches, he says. But is it? A healer's gift or an executioner's tool? She has no choice but to believe, or pretend to, because to doubt him would be to admit danger, and to admit danger would shatter the illusion of intimacy that gave her power. Mainstream anchor. In Renaissance Italy, the Borgia family became infamous for alleged poisonings at banquets. Though much of it was exaggerated by enemies, the fear was real. Any queen rumored to keep lovers risked being painted with the same brush. Beautiful, powerful, and deadly. The shadows of the chamber seem to lean in as you imagine it. A queen sipping wine while her lover watches, both smiling, both wondering if the other is holding back more than secrets. Quirky little twist. Medieval people genuinely believed some gemstones could detect poison when dropped into wine. Emeralds, they thought, would shatter on contact. So imagine the queen wearing a jeweled ring, dipping it discreetly into her goblet, while keeping eye contact with her lover across the table. Scholars still argue whether this was superstition or clever theater, a way to send a message. I know what you might be up to. You chuckle. Talk about foreplay with stakes. The air shifts again, and you leave the chamber. The torchlight flickers on your face, but now the hallway feels colder. You think of queens balancing between poison and passion, trusting lovers who could kiss them or kill them in the same breath. And you realize the most intoxicating part wasn't just the wine. It was the gamble. The cold of the poisoned chamber still lingers on your skin, but as you step forward, the corridor widens again. Heavy doors loom ahead, carved with twisting vines and crowned crests. You push them open, and suddenly, you're not in a hallway anymore. You're in a bedchamber, lavish, sprawling, warmer than anywhere else in the palace. Velvet curtains fall from a high canopy bed, thick enough to drown out the world beyond. Candles glow low, their flames flickering lazily, dripping wax like sand in an hourglass. Here, you realize, was the true throne room. Not the council chamber, not the cathedral, but this bed. Because queens didn't just reign with crowns, they ruled with intimacy. The bed is unmade, sheets twisted like vines after a storm. You run your hand across them, feeling how soft they are, woven not just for sleep, but for spectacle. This was where alliances were sealed, not with ink and seals, but with bodies and breath. Mainstream anchor. Anne Boleyn, though technically later than medieval, embodies this truth. Her allure and intimacy with Henry VIII transformed her from lady-in-waiting to queen. Though her downfall was brutal, her rise showed how a woman's bed could become her battlefield, her bargaining table, and her throne. And you think, in many ways, the queen's body was as much a political instrument as her crown. You hear faint laughter in the chamber, the memory of silken whispers against heavy drapes. Lovers who entered here weren't just partners, they were co-conspirators. Every embrace carried stakes. Was he here because of passion, or because helping the queen meant carving his own place in power? Quirky little fact, some royal beds were so massive they could fit half a dozen people, not for sleepovers, but because bedchambers often doubled as semi-public spaces where trusted courtiers, ladies, or even scribes gathered. Intimacy, then, wasn't always hidden. It was staged, just private enough to ignite rumors, but public enough to shape perception. Accidental glimpses of lovers in their chambers to fan gossip. You can almost hear a servant coughing politely outside the door, pretending not to notice. The curtains sway, and you glimpse a crown resting on the nightstand. It looks absurd here, cold metal beside tangled sheets, but it makes sense. This was the place where politics and passion collided most dangerously. A kiss could turn into leverage. A whispered secret could become state policy. Mainstream anchor again. Eleanor of Aquitaine was accused of taking lovers not just for desire, but to wield influence during her husband's absence. Though historians dispute the accuracy, the persistence of the tales shows how strongly contemporaries believed the queen's bed was also her council chamber. You smile to yourself. Scholars still argue whether these queens actually had such lovers. But even if they didn't, the idea was powerful enough to shape their legacies. The air grows warmer. You close your eyes, hearing the rustle of sheets, the murmur of conspiracies disguised as pillow talk. Queens who ruled from their beds weren't merely indulging themselves. They were rewriting the balance of power, one embrace at a time. And maybe, just maybe, they understood better than anyone that passion was a form of currency, one spent in whispers, collected in loyalty, and sometimes cashed in as survival. So, you step away from the bed, the crown still glinting faintly at its side. The chamber door creaks shut behind you, and as you walk back into the hall, you realize that for all the grandeur of coronations and councils, the queen's true throne wasn't made of stone or gold. It was velvet. You've wandered through chambers of velvet and parchment, across battlefields and into galleries of secret signs. You've listened to whispers tucked into shadows and felt the weight of silence heavier than crowns. And now, the palace grows quiet again. The torches flicker, one by one, until only a faint glow remains. The corridors that once carried footsteps of queens, kings, and lovers now hold only the rhythm of your own breath. The voices of history are still there, but softer, like echoes behind a thick curtain. So take a moment to let your shoulders drop. Unclench your jaw. Notice how the stories you carried with you, stories of desire, of power, of survival, have begun to dissolve like smoke in cool night air. You no longer need to hold them. They can rest now, and so can you. The stone walls around you feel steady, grounding, but the air drifting through the open window is gentle, almost like a lullaby. Imagine the faint hum of a distant lute, or maybe just the wind playing against the shutters. The weight of centuries fades, leaving you with only calm. You are safe. You are still. And the night welcomes you into its embrace. The castle doors close behind us now. The torches dim, the whispers fade, and all that's left is quiet. Carry the echoes with you, but let them soften into dreams. Sweet dreams, traveler. Sleep well.